Welcome to Season 4 of the Ascent Podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, Wealth Advisor at Moxie Wealth Management. Today on the show, we chat with Karin Nelson, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer for the Minnesota Vikings. We hear about her nonlinear career path, important factors for choosing to work in Moscow early in her career, and the fruits of building real and genuine relationships. Karin, it's good to be together again, at least through Zoom. I know our listeners can't see you, but it's nice to see you.
It's great to see you. It's been too long.
Well, so we want to talk more about your journey and your leadership and all that kind of stuff. But before we get into it, we're all fans, so we'd just like to know, what's it like working for the Vikings?
Well, in all honesty, this is a dream job for me. That's no joke. And I don't say that because everything is perfect. I say that because, first of all, I love sports, and I've been a Vikings fan for my whole life. So that part is fun. I think it's really great to kind of take all of the experiences and things I've done, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that throughout our time together today. But to be able to apply it to a new industry and an industry that I've always been so interested in. And sports is unique. It's a unique platform that unites people like no other. And so that part is really great.
Well, you were recently promoted, right?
Right.
And so what's your title, I guess, currently?
Yeah, I am now Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer.
For all the listeners to get a better handle of that, what kind of decisions, what are you doing on a daily basis?
Yeah, so let's talk about the legal part first.
Okay.
Chief Legal Officer is what you might expect. You know, in some organizations that would be referred to as general counsel. For certain organizations, they make that to be a C-level position. And so that is what that's meant to entail. So I'm responsible for the legal department and being the most senior lawyer in the organization.
And by legal, you represent the organization, right? And you're not representing the players.
Right. I do not represent the players. So I represent the Minnesota Vikings Football LLC.
Okay.
And with that, I represent the organization and, you know, the people who work for the organization in their capacity as employees and officers of Minnesota Vikings football.
You know, sometimes when I ask people to explain things to me, I say, draw it out with a crayon. What I mean by that is, in simple terms, can you give me an example or two of the legal things you've had to deal with in the last 6 months?
I'll try to give you maybe a few different examples so you can sort of see the breadth of issues that may come up. And that wouldn't be just in sports. I would say that would be for any, you know, the chief legal officer or general counsel of other organizations as well. For example, we have been working on a lot of sponsorship agreements. We have sponsors with very large companies, some smaller, and that all needs to be negotiated and documented. Okay. That's an important revenue source for the team, as are, you know, suite agreements and things like that. So, you know, with everything that's happened with COVID, a lot of those things needed to be modified and adjusted. So that's a good example on the documentation side of things. I also have a compliance role with the organization. So especially in the last several months, that has been compliance both with NFL requirements and rules, and most importantly right now, the NFL protocols that we had to put in place for the NFL season. So I was part of a small group that worked on that and executed on that. But it can also be compliance with state rules and regulations. And so, you know, I'm the person tasked with making sure I understand the governor's executive orders, that I've read the applicable, you know, regulations that apply to that and ensure that we are in compliance with those as well. So that's an example of the compliance work. On the litigation side, if the team would be involved in litigation, whether we need to bring litigation or we may be sued or in a dispute, then I would manage that process as well. And sometimes it will involve hiring an outside lawyer to represent us in court, and sometimes it's handling that sort of thing. So those are kind of three distinct examples of things that I would have worked on in the last 6 months.
Got it. And also then, as the executive vice president, what is your role there?
So I work with other executive vice presidents, if you will. So whether that's the EVP and CFO or the EVP of public affairs with our chief operating officer, our chief revenue officer. So we work together as a group and discuss the big issues, if you will, for the organization and try to come to good decisions on a wide variety of things. Everything from season ticket pricing, it could be, are we going to be able to have training camp this year in person or not? If we do, how, it's decisions like that. And sometimes it's just conversations with us to help us each be better in our respective leadership roles.
So as we're recording this is the beginning of 2021. And of course, last year, we've all had to go through COVID, and particularly the NFL and the Vikings. Since last March, what has that process been like?
Yeah, there's so many words I feel like that come into my head today. It's been grueling, I would say. It's also maybe you'll find this strange, Joe, I don't know, but it's also been exhilarating in some ways, not COVID itself, of course, but whenever you're faced with big challenging issues, I think when you work hard to rise to that occasion and to do what's best for the organization, what you believe is best and what's best for our staff members, including our players, there's something that's meaningful about that. Mm-hmm. I have really felt that sense of purpose really every single day since this hit. There's a lot of really, getting down in the weeds, writing the plan of how we're going to follow everything and getting NFL approval for that. That took days and days and days of hard work, right? To just get it and then have the NFL to approve it. And then the NFL, as we needed to, the protocol changed. Sometimes it changed several times a week. Sometimes it changed, every couple of weeks, but staying on top of that and making sure that all aligned with what we were expected to do in the state of Minnesota. And thankfully, because the NFL had a very strict protocol, there usually wasn't a conflict. So, and then, there were other things that would come in for approval. So let's say a contractor needed to get into the building for a certain reason, right? Mm-hmm. All those requests were funneled in to our small COVID committee. So we reviewed every one of those. Does this person really need to get in? If so, what are the protocols are we going to require testing for that person to come into our facility? If not, what are the next things? Going through that level of detail. So yeah, it was, and I can still remember, Joe, the day this all started. I had been on vacation the first week in March. Mm-hmm. And I was really excited because I was in Hawaii and I hadn't been there for, almost 30 years, I think. And I landed on a Sunday and I came into the office that Monday, which I think was maybe March 9th. I think that was the right date. Mm-hmm. And, I was following the news and you knew that life was going to be changing, but literally I had not even put my briefcase down. It was like, Karin, okay, I think we're going to have to close the office. We're probably going to do that this week. We've got to develop our plan and our policy. What are the employment implications? And it was like, boom. And by Thursday, we had shut down the office. Right. And from then on, it feels like it's just been a sprint.
Oh, man. So I remember that week, my spring break was supposed to be the following Monday. So I was leaving the 16th, right? And I think if we were leaving the 9th, we would have still gone. But I remember there was a concert I was going to Friday night at the Excel. And about Wednesday, the other couple we were going with said, yeah, I think we're going to back out of this Friday night concert, right? And I thought, well, that's weird. And then by Thursday, it didn't even seem weird to me anymore. By Thursday, I was like, oh, yeah, we can't go to this thing. And then by Friday, of course, they canceled the concert, and there it was. Right. It was amazing how fast it went from there's something going on out there to it's right here, it's right now, and we need to change.
Yeah, it's so true.
Well, that is very interesting. And I want to shift a little bit to you didn't have a real linear path to getting to the Vikings. You've made a number of different changes in your career. You didn't even start out as an attorney, right?
That's true. I was an accounting major in undergrad. I graduated from what was Mankato State, now with a different name, of course. But I was a CPA first, and I was an auditor, and that's what I did for 3 years before I went to law school.
And what makes you decide? I mean, were you just in this auditing process going, all right, this is not my thing? Or because it seems like if you went to schooling for something of a specific career, to pull up the stakes and go to a different path, that seems like a pretty big decision.
Yeah, it was a big change. And I'm someone, I really try to take all of, what can you learn from every situation, right? Instead of focusing on maybe not what's great. So I don't regret the time I spent as an auditor and as a CPA for a second. I really think that understanding financial statements and frankly, understanding what auditors do and what they don't do has been really helpful for me, both in law and just generally in business. But it was clear pretty early on that I didn't have a passion for it, Joe. And it was hard to imagine doing that for many, many, many years, not because it was boring. It just didn't have that spark. So I really went back to some advice that college professors had given me who, as an accounting major, you do need to take, it's either 2 or 3 law-related classes, undergrad legal classes. And I did very well in those classes, and I really liked them. And I remember being encouraged, would you ever think about going to law school? And I was, no, I'm not going to school. When I graduate, I'm not going to school anymore. And,
right.
But, you think about those things. And honestly, I relied on prayer to help guide me. I did not have the benefit of knowing any lawyers. As strange as it sounds, I had never met a lawyer in person before I went to law school. And I grew up in a very, very small rural community, and I just had never had a chance to. But I thought about that. I just did some research, and then I heard about this thing called an LSAT.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't know really what this is, but I'm going to take this test. And if I do well, it is a sign. And I did well, and then I went for it. In some ways, you could say it really wasn't very well planned, but I think it's worked out well. And this has been my passion and my spark in all the different legal roles that I've had.
And so as soon as you get done with law school, you were a litigator for just a smaller window of time, right? And then you moved on to Cargill?
Yes, I was a litigator for almost 6 years.
Got it. And then what drew you to Cargill from being the litigator?
That was another sort of interesting transition because, as you know, in life and especially in work life, sometimes the best opportunities may come in through a informal or non-traditional way. And so I went to law school at the University of Iowa, and someone who was a couple years ahead of me was working at Cargill. I didn't know her well, but we had a mutual friend that we were both very good friends with. And she knew enough about me and said, do you think Karin might be interested? There's an opening at Cargill. It's actually closing in a couple of days, but have her apply if she's interested. So then I relied on the fact that I knew Cargill from the grain side of the business because I grew up on a farm. I also knew that Cargill had a great reputation as being an ethical company and hiring good people and people who tended to stay there for a long time. And I said, I'm just going to go interview and see what this feels like. And I truly fell in love with the people. I really did from that first day of all-day interviews. And then I asked to go back to meet with some people who maybe weren't interviewing, but would be more of my peer group. And met with them, and I was sold.
And what's it like working for an organization that has the type of scale that Cargill has, right? I mean, there's 150,000 employees?
I think when you get there, because in the law department at that time, we were, assigned to a business unit. And so I was assigned immediately to the animal nutrition business unit, which was a wonderful blessing for me because the people there, like Todd Hall, who and Richard Frosch, I don't know if you knew him, but Pat Webster, who I mean, I just worked with incredible human beings and great leaders. I think I sort of was introduced in a gradual basis to that breadth of Cargill because I was so focused on this particular business unit. And luckily for me, it was a global business unit. And when I had been with Cargill about 3 years is when we did the Agribrands acquisition, which at the time I think was Cargill's biggest acquisition, but that has long been surpassed. But that was incredibly exciting. And Agribrands operations were all outside the US. So that's when I really started getting the true kind of scope of the global scale. And then, you just spend more time there and then you start working with other lawyers who are working with other businesses. And then, I lived abroad for 6 years where I was able to get experience with so many different parts of Cargill's global businesses.
Two thoughts. One of them, just for reference for people listening, there's been a lot of reorg over time, but at one point in time, I believe there's over 70 business units, right, within Cargill?
There used to be. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to tell you now, but that number sounds right to me from probably 10 years ago.
Sure. And animal nutrition, where you were, was probably top 3 or so in revenue, 3 or 4 out of the 70 business units, right?
Yeah, it would depend on the year, but it was certainly most of the time that I was with animal nutrition, that was typically one of the top revenue generating businesses for Cargill. And now, that business I think is broken up into some more specialties.
So when you're deciding to go and maybe live abroad on your own, was there any trepidation?
There was trepidation. I think sometimes people think that, they see someone who they perceive as having a successful career and they think everything was smooth and, but that's just not how life is. So how do you work through some important decisions and work through challenges and things, I think is an important life and professional skill, if you will. My first reaction, well, first, there were two pieces to it. When the general counsel of Cargill then, who has become a dear friend, he and his wife are still good friends of mine, and he retired many years ago. He first approached me about going to Geneva initially. And, Cargill would typically have, as part of its advancement and development, would typically have at least one lawyer in Europe, someone they perceive to have potential future leadership. So I knew that this was, a big thing and something I honestly had spent no time thinking about it. But, I thought this seems like a good opportunity. And then quickly the circumstances changed where Steve, the general counsel then, called me again and said, "Hey, can you come over? I need to talk to you quickly." I'm like, this seems curious, but okay. Because he's not someone who would summon you over to the lake.
Right.
And he said, "Look, our lead lawyer in Russia has left suddenly. We weren't expecting it. Your role in Geneva, as you know, you'd be overseeing Eastern Europe. I would like you, if you're willing, to go to Russia first and spend anywhere from, 6 to 12 months there, help us find who the lead lawyer is going to be. We're working on a big acquisition there, do that kind of work. And then we'd move you to Geneva after." And I said, "I don't think so." I mean, that was my first that was my first reaction. And, Steve is cool as a cucumber, and he's someone who lived all over the world for Cargill. And he said, "Karin, do me a favor. I want you to go to Moscow next week. I want you to meet the country rep, just meet the legal team there. Laura's going to meet you from Belgium. She's going to meet you. That's who I would be reporting to out of Russia. And then talk to your, whoever your mentors who, and talk through this. But I think you're going to be surprised. And I really want you to consider this." So I did. And one of the people that I spoke with first was someone who was the former president of the animal nutrition business, Richard Frost. And I went in his office almost immediately, and he just helped me kind of frame the decision, did not tell me what I should do, but these are the things I would think about, he said. Get as much information as you can on these areas. and then make a decision. But you don't have to make a decision today. It had to be made quickly. And I did that. And I talked to some people who had, worked in Russia. And I went to Moscow within 2 weeks. And Steve was right. And I came back and I said, I'm in. I'm going to do it. But my first reaction was, no way. Like, this seems too scary. Yeah. It just seemed too scary. And I'll tell you that experience, that time in Russia, I spent 9 months there before I moved to Geneva. I left that experience, first of all, having a huge appreciation for Russian culture and the people there who are largely lovely. This is when we get caught up in politics and we tend to have stereotypes of people, you don't get to know the real people. I'm telling you, these people were fantastic. But there were bumps in the road. Russian is a very difficult language. It's a huge city, so much bigger than the Twin Cities. And, there were times when I was lonely as well. It's not like you could just have people pop over from the U.S. whenever you wanted to see somebody.
Right.
So I left that experience with a lot of confidence and believing that I could tackle a lot more than I really thought that I could. And that was a really key development time for me. And then, I moved to Geneva, and it was a whole different set of businesses there and different challenges. I went into that just feeling a lot better about those challenges. And again, it wasn't perfect, but, and then I built on that and moved to Singapore for a year and a half as Asia Pacific General Counsel. And it was a transformational time for me personally and professionally.
Well, that's great. And, it sounds like as you went, you just got more confidence that there was more that you could tackle. What was the tipping point to take the first step? I think you experienced Moscow and you got an idea of what it would be like. But ultimately, when you were weighing your options of your initial, no way, I'm not going to do this, to, yeah, I'm going to give it a shot. What was the general theme that you finally settled on where you said, you know what, I'm going to make this work?
I'm not sure if there was just one thing, but there were a couple things. And for me, people and culture are extremely important. And when I went to the Moscow office, I could feel, first of all, how proud these people were to be part of the Cargill organization, how well they worked together, how much they embraced me, even from those first few days I was there. And that's not always the case when a global company sends someone from the headquarters in the U.S. It doesn't always go that way. So I think the people there really made it a lot. They're no longer ambiguous to you. You're starting to get to know them, and you realize that this could be something special. And I think also my family's reaction was so positive too, that helped so much. Not that, I was obviously a grown adult making this decision, but you care what your parents think. And when my brother and I are very close, and everyone was so encouraging about this, I knew that they would want to travel to see me in those places. And that helped a lot, that they didn't think it was crazy.
Right.
So I think those were the two things. And I think deep down, I knew that professionally, there would be no other experience like that. And if I really did want to think about trying to be the general counsel for Cargill, this was something that I needed to do. So I think it was all of that wrapped up.
So you go abroad, you learn, you grow, you get promoted. For many people, the idea would be that you're on the other side now. And maybe that Cargill would be where you'd stay for the rest of your career. How does a transition to the Vikings come about?
So I was at Cargill for 18 years. So it was a long time, I guess, maybe not for some Cargill people
right.
to your point, but
it's all relative, yeah.
That was the biggest chunk of my career for sure.
Yeah.
This opportunity with the Vikings also did not come up in a traditional way. I think this is another example of why I really try to emphasize with people that the importance of not networking, because I find that word to be almost a negative, building real and genuine relationships with people, because you just don't know what can happen and what can occur out of these relationships. But I had met Kevin Warren, who was then the chief operating officer for the Minnesota Vikings. And now, as you probably know, he's the Big Ten commissioner. Mm-hmm. And we had met through a mutual friend and someone that I used to be a lawyer with at a law firm. And she knew I love sports and the Vikings in particular. And so she had introduced me. And so he and I had just, sort of struck up a friendship. And what I didn't know at the time is that because he had just been recently promoted to chief operating officer from general counsel, mm-hmm. he really could not continue. It was too much to try to be general counsel and be chief operating officer. Mm-hmm. And he was really trying to figure out who would be a good fit for that role. And so I think when we started having a coffee or a drink or dinner together to get to know each other better, that I think throughout this, he was really starting to evaluate and assess, mm-hmm. Whether I could be his successor in the general counsel role. But this took this is probably a year and a half. I mean, honestly. And then when he said at one point, "What do you think? Would you ever consider," and Kevin knows a lot of people at Cargill, mm-hmm. so it's not like he would do this. He knew that I was grounded there and was very grateful to be part of that organization for so long. Mm-hmm. It kind of surprised me at first a little bit, but I felt like it was unique enough that I needed to give it serious consideration. And honestly, we still talked about it for a lot more. I mean, this was not a fast process mm-hmm. by any stretch, mm-hmm. but it was the right process, because if it would have been sprung on me right at the beginning, I think my reaction would have been, I just don't think so.
Kind of like going to Moscow.
Cargill, Cargill's been good to me, and I hope I've been good to Cargill, mm-hmm. but, I had to get more comfortable with not just Kevin, but a lot of, what will I be doing there exactly? And who are the people there? And mm-hmm. who will be my peer group? And all of these things. So that opportunity came up through me staying friends with someone else who was friends with Kevin. And then Kevin and I developing a very true and genuine relationship before the offer came. Mm-hmm. Then I just kind of had to go with my gut, knowing mm-hmm. that it is extremely unlikely to move to this kind of role at an NFL team at this stage of my career. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't turn it down.
Right. What's been the biggest difference, between working for a large company like Cargill, where maybe there's over 150,000 employees and billions of dollars of revenue, versus working with the Vikings, who, of course, in our market and everywhere are wildly popular, but maybe only have 200 or so employees?
One difference that people may not immediately think of, certainly the number of employees, obviously the overall revenue, those sorts of things are on a completely different scale with mm-hmm. Cargill. Professional football, and certainly the Vikings in this market, have such a big profile. And so one thing that's different to me, and I knew it would be this way, but you don't know how different it will be until you're in it. Mm-hmm. Every day there are stories about the team or about the organization in some way, whether it's on the football side or other things. And so, I start my day typically by looking to see what's been in the news since I last turned off my, mm-hmm. There's just a high profile here for that. So that was different. Cargill has a big profile too, but still somehow it manages to stay under the radar just a bit. Not like it used to, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's one difference. I will say also, a smaller organization will not have all of the systems and processes that a large organization has mm-hmm. or needs to have. So a part of what I've tried to do is figure out where could we benefit from having a few more systems and processes. You don't want to over-engineer it and have it more complicated than it needs to be. Mm-hmm. But there are things that, an organization can be better run and better organized with certain things in place. So I hope that's a little bit of what I can bring, is to try to get a little more structure, if mm-hmm. you will. So I think those things are the biggest difference.
Right. Does working in the NFL ever have an off season? I guess what I mean is there a bigger workload with the Vikings than there was at Cargill?
Yeah, it is. And I don't say that in a negative way. I think partly it's to my role now too, but I think that there isn't a true downtime, especially when you're working, on the business side. And a lot of times when the season itself is over, that just, generates a lot of other things that need to happen in the off season. Mm-hmm. And I think there's just something about being an executive in a smaller organization. Things come up when they do, and you need to be available to deal with that. And I have to imagine that, the CEO of Cargill and his senior leadership team, that's the same thing. You don't know when that need is going to come, but it tends to come not infrequently, right. I would say. Right. And you feel if someone leaves, for example, so I had a lawyer who left this fall to go to New Balance for a great opportunity in a different kind of sports-related job. When that happens during the season and, it's during COVID and, mm-hmm. We're not able to immediately replace, that has an immediate impact on how are we delivering legal services and how are we going to get through the rest of the season. You kind of don't have that big bench to work with. So I think that's part of it. But, there are things like our office closes. This will be the third year, I think, where we're closing the whole week of the 4th of July, where everyone on football and on business side, shut their laptops and people aren't sending emails. And that's very unusual that you can kind of get everyone mm-hmm. to agree that barring some sort of emergency, everyone is out. And I'm really looking forward to this year.
Well, that's great. Well, one of the other things, I was thinking about that you've been around a lot of good leaders throughout your journey, and now you're within the Vikings, you're around other leaders, you're in a leadership position yourself. What do you think are some core characteristics of good leaders?
I do feel incredibly blessed, and I so sincerely mean that, to have worked with the caliber of leaders that I worked with at Cargill and now that I'm working with at the Vikings. My experience has taught me that there are certain traits that, first of all, that I respect very much, but I do think that people who have been the best in those leadership roles tend to have. One of those is for sure resiliency. And honestly, if I had to pick one, it's hard for me to pick one, but resiliency is absolutely critical. And I think this year has really proven that out. And adaptability goes with that, although it's a slightly different trait, but you have to be able to pivot. It can't be the end of the world when you pivot. To tie this to what we were talking about before, my experiences in Russia and some of those, mm-hmm. the concept of resiliency has been something that's really latched onto me personally. And I talk to a lot of young professionals about it. But I have very much a visual in my mind when something happens that seems too daunting and that you're not able to solve this or we're not going to get through it. I really have a visual of standing up and dusting myself off and putting my hands on my hips and moving on. I mean, that's a very strong visual for me. And however people do it, you have to find a way to dust yourself off and get back up and fight another day. I think those two traits are really critical. And then the other one, I think, for me is intellectual curiosity. And people who are the most curious, truly curious about how things work and what makes people tick, and asking questions of people who may have expertise that they don't, and taking that all in. That all of these things together, to me, are going to make a pretty great leader.
Well, and as a leader, how important is it for you to know the people who report to you personally? Maybe to get a better understanding of what their motivations are.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I might describe, there's two pieces to that when I hear you say that, Joe. I think part of that is developing better listening skills and having more empathy. Empathy has never been more important than it is right now, I think. But when you can put that together, that really helps you to understand where people are in whatever stage they are in their development and whatever challenges that they may be facing. And then the other piece to that is there's nothing that replaces or substitutes for building good relationships. There's no shortcut to that either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes
time. That's why I mentioned it does.
Yeah.
It is a time and investment to get to know people and to get to know them well. And most people want to shortcut that. And that's why I think this networking concept is something that I resist so much, because it sounds fake, kind of. Mm-hmm. It sounds disingenuous. When you build a real two-way relationship, that's something that stands. And hopefully both parties are working together to help each other. And if it's in the work setting, you're making the organization better by that relationship that you've built.
Right. How would you define success?
Wow, that's a really big question.
By nature, I want to be more specific in the question, but I really want to see where that would go and how you would think about it.
I think the way I would answer that now is different than I probably would have answered it 10, 15, 20 years ago. While I certainly want to be paid fairly for what I do, I think that success to me is not driven by the check that I make. While being recognized for your work and having a certain title is important, again, I don't think that defines success for me. I do think that where I feel like I can make real impacts in certain areas. So how am I leaving either the organization or people in a better place than where they were before? That, I think, is a big driver for me. And so I want to make the time to, whether it's with, mentoring, whether that's in the organization or a lot of, frankly, law students or young professionals. Mm-hmm. There are still some people at Cargill that I try to serve that role mm-hmm. with. That really matters to me. And if those people benefit from that and they can achieve their goals, that makes me feel like I've been successful. And then I think there are certain areas that are really important to me personally. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that I'm a true champion and advocate for. And so I think working within our organization to further our efforts there and within the legal profession is very fulfilling. And so if I can help move that needle, that would be enormous personal success for me.
That's great. As you look forward, what are you most excited about?
So on a personal level, I cannot wait to hug my parents and to hug my brother and to spend quality time with. I'm so blessed with the village of friends that I have. And that has been really, really personally difficult to not have that for this long. Mm-hmm. So my parents received their first dose of the vaccination last week. My sister-in-law and my niece, who are both teachers, got their first dose. I was so happy. I was crying because for my parents in their 80s, this is life and death,
yeah, right? Absolutely.
So I know we're getting closer to that day, and that, I'm getting teary just thinking about it. I can't wait to drive that 3 hours home to the farm mm-hmm. and be able to do that. And I think on the professional side, I think I'm really looking forward to. We've had some organizational changes, so we're going to be announcing next week who our new CMO is, and being part of that interview process and decision process, I am over the moon excited about what this person's going to bring. I think this person will make our organization better and stronger in certain key areas. I think our executive leadership team is going to be better for it. And I think we're on the cusp of being, moving as an organization. And I mean all of it. I know people think about the Vikings and they think football, as you should. But there's a lot of people who are doing a whole lot of other great things. And we're on the cusp of going from really good to great in all of these areas. And I want to influence and help and ensure that we get there.
Well, Karin, I guess we're going to have to leave that there, but I really appreciate you taking the time and explaining your journey and how you think about leadership. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
I have as well. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Karin Nelson, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer for the Minnesota Vikings. If you'd like to know more about her, the Vikings, or the current community initiatives sponsored by the Minnesota Vikings Foundation, just go to Vikings.com. Next time on the show, we chat with Rob Culligan, Vice President of Institutional Advancement at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. Rob talks about the first time Father Don LeMay, the Vice President of External Relations at the university, suggested he might be a good development officer.
And I looked at him with panic, and I said, Father Don, I could never ask anybody for money.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ascent Podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, wealth advisor and founding partner of Moxie Wealth Management. You can learn more about me and my firm at moxiewealthmanagement.com. That's MOXIE wealthmanagement.com. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.